Gather around the fire, sisters, under a sky stitched with stars and secrets, as I spin a tale of the untamed West. It's late winter 1876, the rugged plains of post-Civil War Wyoming, where snow falls like a widow's veil, slow and mournful, cloaking the world in silence so deep it could choke a scream. The wind howls through the pines, sharp as a blade, slicing across a lone cabin on the edge of nowhere. Inside, a single oil lamp flickers not for comfort, but for survival. Keeping the dark at bay, not for hope, but because that's what you do when the ghosts in your chest howl louder than the storm outside. Elias Holt wasn't a man of tales. His face, a weathered map of loss and labor, bore scars etched by frost and grief. His gray eyes clouded like a winter sky. His hands, broad and rough as burlap, moved with the weight of a man who'd buried more than he'd ever held. He carved slow, not from laziness, but from fear that haste might shatter the fragile piece he'd carved out of nothing. Once, Elias had been a man of laughter, humming tunes as he worked the land, the air alive with the hum of bees, the scratch of hens, the scent of blooming sage. His Sarah had tended her garden with a love so fierce, it seemed the flowers grew just to please her golden daisies, crimson paintbrush, purple lupine. After her death, the garden withered under weeds, then snow, then nothingness. He couldn't bear to touch it again. The storm outside grew wilder, a beast clawing at the plains. Snow didn't drift but crept, inch by inch, burying the world in white. Elias stirred the fire with a poker, the flames casting shadows that danced like memories across the walls. He sank into his chair, a creak of wood and a sigh of bone, his body aching with a cold that lived in his marrow, a chill born not of weather, but of a heart that hadn't beat fully in years. It was a quiet ache, the kind that didn't roar but whispered, seeping into him like frost on glass. He sipped his cold black coffee, the bitterness a ritual, not a comfort. Then he heard it 3 knocks, deliberate, not the wind's cruel jest, not a coyote's scratch, human. He froze. A 4th knock, softer, trembling. A pause, then another. Elias rose, his joints groaning like old timber. Days since a soul had braved the snow-choked trail to his door. He unlatched the bolt, opening the door with the wariness of a man who'd learned the world held more thorns than roses. There she stood, a woman swathed in a tattered shawl, its edges iced over, her calico dress patched and faded beneath. Her bonnet was gone, her chestnut hair a wet tangle, snowflakes melting into tears on her cheeks. Behind her, 3 small figures huddled under a single wool blanket, threadbare and soaked children, no taller than his thigh, their faces pale as moonlight, eyes wide with fear and frost. Her gaze met his, raw and unyielding, a fire in her hazel eyes that refused to die. She didn't speak, but her trembling breath was a plea louder than words. Her knees buckled, but she caught herself, a mother's will stronger than the storm. Elias stepped aside, silent. She ushered the children in, her arms stiff as iron, whispering comforts too faint to carry. He shut the door, the latch clicking like a promise against the blizzard's howl. They stood by the hearth, water pooling at their feet. The smallest child, a girl with golden curls, clutching a sodden rag doll like it held her very soul. Elias tossed a log into the fire, sparks snapping like gunfire, the glow painting their faces in shades of amber and hope. Silence hung heavy, broken only by the drip of melting snow. Then her voice cut through, rough as gravel but steady as stone. "The horse, we've walked 3 days. Wagon broke east of Frostbite Pass. I couldn't carry him all at once." Elias nodded, a gesture more than a word. She pressed on, her voice finding its footing. "I'm Clara. These are mine, Jasper, Levi, and Maisie." The boys dipped their heads, shy as fawns. Maisie blinked, her doll squeezed tighter. "You lost?" he asked, his voice a low rasp. "Unused for days?" "No," she said, the word a confession. "Left." That single syllable carried a lifetime. Elias didn't pry. He pointed to the chairs by the fire. "Sit. Dry. I'll fetch something warm." They obeyed, their movements small and careful, like mice in a hawk's shadow. He returned with broth thin, made from the last of his dried venison, but steaming. The children lunged for it, sipping with desperate gulps, while Clara watched, her own bowl untouched. "Eat," Elias said, his tone gruff but kind. "I will," she replied, her eyes never leaving her kids. He saw her, then really saw her. Her face was gaunt, hollowed by hunger, but her jaw was set with a pride that refused to break. He knew what it cost her to stand there, to accept his roof, to ask for anything at all. When the kids finished, they curled into a pile on the rug. Maisie nestled between her brothers like a chick between wings. Elias pulled a quilt from a cedar chest. Sarah's quilt, stitched with love and blood, and draped it over them, the fabric smelling of pine and memory. Clara watched him, her gaze sharp but softening. "You live here alone?" she asked, her voice gentle as a breeze. He nodded. 2 winters now. Her eyes dimmed with understanding. "I'm sorry." He shrugged, the motion heavy. "Storms come. Sometimes they linger." The fire popped, filling the quiet. Then she spoke, her voice a whisper, as if the words might break her. "I was headin' west to Cheyenne. Thought I had kin waitin'. My husband. He turned back when the food ran dry. Said I'd made my choice comin' out here." Elias studied her. "He left you in winter, with young'uns." She nodded, her lips a tight line. "Wasn't a storm then. Just silence." He didn't reply. Instead, he poured her a mug of fresh coffee, the steam rising like a prayer, and slid it across the table. She took it, her hands trembling not from cold, but from the weight of what she carried. "You can stay," he said, his voice low, "till the trail clears." Her eyes met his, a flicker of something relief. Maybe, or fear of what came next. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't need to." "I do." He returned to his chair, picking up the half-carved pine on his lap. The silence that followed wasn't hollow anymore. It was warm, the kind that didn't demand words, only presence. He noticed the children's breaths, soft and steady, how Clara tucked her shawl tighter not to shut him out, but to hold herself together. The fire roared, a guardian against the storm. Outside, the blizzard raged, but inside, for the first time in years, Elias felt the air shift, not warm yet, but thawing. He glanced at Clara as she sipped her coffee, her eyes tracing the flames dance. She didn't rest, not fully, but her walls had cracked, letting light seep through enough for him to wonder if, come spring, The sage outside might bloom again. But that was for tomorrow. Tonight. The snow fell, the lamp flickered, and the cabin held 5 souls bound by storm and chance. Elias had stopped believing in miracles, but he believed in doors that opened against the odds, and sometimes that was enough. Morning came, the storm retreating like a wounded wolf, leaving the plains in a silence so pure it felt sacred. The snow gleamed, a diamond crust unbroken save for the faint tracks to Elias Holt's door marks of desperation, now softened by sleep and warmth. Inside, the air smelled of ash, broth, and pine's faint sweetness. Clara woke first, her eyes sharp with a mother's instinct, rising from the floor where her shawl had been her pillow. She reached for her children, bundled under the quilt, their cheeks flushed with heat, not frost. She stood, stepping lightly to avoid the creaking boards, and moved to the kitchen corner where Elias stirred a pot over a low flame, his movements as quiet as dawn. "You slept," he said, not looking up. "Tried to," she replied, pulling her shawl tight. "Thank you for last night." He nodded, the gesture heavy with meaning, and handed her a bowl of oatmeal, simple, salted, the spoon warm from his hand. She took it and sat by the window, staring at the horizon as it blushed pale gold. The sky looked fragile, a glass dome ready to shatter. Storms passed, Elias said. Tracks are gone. Won't find 'em for days. I ain't lookin'. She didn't meet his gaze, and he didn't ask her to. The children stirred, blinking into the morning light. Levi sat up first, rubbing his eyes with a grubby fist. Jasper followed, yawning wide, crawling toward the fire's warmth. Maisie woke last, her doll still clutched tight, her golden curls a halo in the dawn. "Come on," Clara called softly. "Wash up, no fussin'." They shuffled to the basin by the back door, where a bucket of melted snow waited. They moved with the quiet obedience of survival. Elias watched from afar, noting how Maisie leaned into Clara's side, how Levi stood over the bucket, shivering but stubborn. These kids had seen more than most men, he thought. And Clara, her strength was a quiet thread, woven into every gesture, every glance. Nothing loud, but everything lasting. As the day warmed, Elias stepped outside to tend the livestock. His boots crunched through the snow's icy shell, the cold biting his face like a whip. In the barn, he fed the animals, his hands steady, his mind on the strangers in his cabin, no longer strangers, but a weight he couldn't shake. When he returned, the cabin had shifted, subtle but real. Clara had swept the floor, laid the kids' damp clothes by the fire to dry, and mended a tear in his old flannel shirt. She hadn't asked. She moved with the grace of someone who knew order was a kind of healing. "Didn't have to do that," Elias said, hanging his coat. "I know," she replied, tying off the thread. "But it makes me feel I belong, even for a moment." He watched her hands steady, purposeful, her voice free of bitterness. Only truth. He wondered when someone last told her she didn't have to prove her worth. The kids softened by the hour. After breakfast, Jasper found a wooden bear on the mantel, a toy Elias had carved years ago, untouched, heavy with memory. "You make this?" Jasper asked, holding it up like a prize. Elias nodded. "Long time ago." "It's real fine," the boy said, turning it over in his hands. "Can I show Maisie keep it?" Elias said. Jasper's grin flashed, sudden and bright, striking Elias like a ray of sun through storm clouds, a warmth he'd forgotten he craved. By afternoon, the cabin hummed with life. Elias chopped wood while Clara boiled water to wash the kids' socks, the steam rising like a ghost. Jasper followed him outside, stacking logs with small, eager hands. They worked in near silence, though Jasper asked about the axe, the best wood to split, how to spot good timber. Elias answered with the same steady rhythm he used for everything, noting how the boy absorbed every word, not just copying, but learning. Inside. Clara stood by the stove, stirring a pot with one hand while Maisie clung to her skirt, humming a tune only she knew. Levi sat by the window, a scrap of paper on his lap, sketching the wooden bear with a charred stick. The air felt alive not just from the fire, but from the quiet give and take, the stitching of a fragile bond. As dusk fell, Clara sat at the table, mending a sock, when Elias spoke what he'd held back all day. "You planning to leave when the trail clears?" Her needle paused, then moved again. "Don't know," she said finally. "Ain't nowhere waiting for us now. You had kin in the West." "Thought I did. A cousin in Cheyenne. But she wrote she's heading south? No address? No trail?" Elias nodded. "Slow. There's work if you want it. Mrs. Tanner in town runs the mercantile. Might need help come spring. She's fond of young'uns." Clara looked at him, her eyes searching not for a trap, but for a lifeline. "You offerin' us a place, I'm offerin' shelter," Elias said. "Maybe something more solid. You don't owe me nothin'. I just think this land's wide enough for more than ghosts." She didn't smile, but her eyes softened, like ice melting at winter's end. That night, the wind didn't scream, it murmured, the kind of sound that lived in lullabies and shared silences. The kids slept under the quilt, their breaths a soft chorus. Clara helped Elias wash the dishes, their hands brushing in the soapy water, rough, scarred, carrying stories they hadn't yet shared. They didn't speak of it, but they didn't pull away. Later, Elias sat by the fire, the pine on his lap taking shape a hawk now, wings spread, fierce and free. He hadn't planned it that way. Some things carved themselves. Clara stood by the window, arms crossed, watching the stars pierce the dark. "It's peaceful here," she said, her voice a whisper. "The kind you earn, not steal." He didn't reply. He didn't need to. She knew he agreed. He nodded to the chair by the fire. She took it. Outside, the moon rose, silvering the snow. Inside, silence bloomed not empty, but full of what could be. The warmth they'd built that day held strong against the cold that had once devoured them both. Beyond the frost, a new rhythm stirred, one neither had dared hope for, one worth staying to hear. The thaw came in whispers, frost melting day by day. Snow retreated near the well, then along the cabin's eaves, icicles dripping like tears. Elias felt it in the door's easy swing, the wind now carrying scents of wet earth and pine. Spring crept in, quiet as faith. Inside, the cabin sang with life. Elias carved for the kids now, not just for himself. Jasper took to it most, watching with hawk-like focus as Elias shaped pine into life. The boy sat beside him, a small knife in hand, mimicking with a reverence that made the act holy. "That's a deer," Jasper said one morning, peering over Elias's shoulder as shavings fell like snowflakes. "It is," Elias said. "You make 'em from memory some. Others come from nothing. Hands remember what the mind don't. Jasper grinned, bright as dawn. I'll make a wolf. Takes patience. I got plenty, Jasper said, chest puffed. Mama says I wait better in Levi. Levi scowled from the corner, a tattered book on his lap. Don't. Maisie sat by the window, humming to her doll named Sarah, after Clara asked Elias his wife's name with a tenderness that broke him open. Clara changed too, her edges softening. She moved with less fear, her smiles coming easier, her glances lingering on Elias like a touch. She cooked now, her meals simple but warm with care, broth thickened with wild onion, bread baked with the last of the flour. Elias ate slower, savoring the love in each bite. One evening, as she set a bowl of stew before him, she lingered. You eat too little, she said, her voice soft as a caress. I eat what I need. You need more'n you think. It wasn't about the food. They both knew. That night, he finished the hawk, setting it on the mantel beside the bear. By morning, it was by Maisie's pillow. The land awoke slowly, creeks gurgling, trees budding, birds returning with cautious songs. One afternoon, the kids played in the melting yard, Maisie napping on the porch with Sarah under her chin. Clara and Elias were alone in the kitchen, her kneading dough, him fixing a hinge. Didn't think you'd bake bread, he said. Learned when I was waitin' for someone who never came back, she replied, her hands steady. He was gone long before I left. He was gone long before I admitted it, she said, wiping flour on her apron. The kind of man who loves you only when you don't need him. Elias nodded. Plenty of those. She met his gaze, a quiet understanding passing between them. You ever wish you'd left sometimes, he said. But I'd carry her ghost either way. Here, I know its shape. She pressed her hands into the dough. Grief's funny. You think it'll break you, but it builds you instead. Makes a space you didn't plan to fill. And when someone steps in, you don't know if you should let him stay. Exactly like that, he said. They fell silent, the space between them warm, inviting. That night, Levi woke burning with fever, his cries sharp in the dark. Clara held him, whispering tales of rivers and starlight, her eyes bright with fear. Elias fetched rags, boiled water, searched for willow bark. He sat by her through the worst, watching her rock her son, her voice a lifeline. You can sleep, he said, his voice a low rumble. Not till he's through, she said. He will be. How do you know he's still here? Her fingers brushed his as he handed her a cloth, the touch a quiet vow. Levi's fever broke before dawn. Clara turned to Elias, her eyes weary but trusting. You didn't have to stay. I wanted to. She leaned against him, just for a moment, finding solace in his steadiness. The days after glowed with life. The kids settled into a rhythm mornings by the fire, afternoons with Elias, evenings with Clara's songs. Their laughter rang true now, pure and childlike. Elias carved for their joy deer, owls, wolves. Jasper dreamed of a wooden forest. Maisie begged for a butterfly. Levi wanted a coyote. One morning, Maisie slipped into Elias's workshop, climbing onto the bench to watch him carve wings. That for me, she asked, her voice a whisper. If you want it, it's pretty. What's a butterfly mean change, he said. From crawlin' to flyin'? Mama says we changed, she said. We were scared little worms. Now we're a family." Elias smiled, his heart cracking open. She's right. By April, the cabin was alive with warmth, not just from the fire. The kids called him Elias now, no sir. Once, Jasper called him Pa, then froze, blushing. Elias just rested a hand on his shoulder. Jasper grinned, the word settling between them. One evening, Clara stood at the workshop door, watching Elias sand the butterfly's wings. "You're good to 'em," she said. "They make it easy." She traced the carvings on the shelf. "They talk about you all day? Levi says you know every tree's name. He's stretchin' the truth. But he believes it." "They're healin'," she said. "Faster'n I thought. They're kids. They trust again." "Wish I could," she said, her voice soft. Elias set the carving down, his gaze steady. "I ain't here to take anyone's place, but if you need someone to stay, I'm here." Her eyes shimmered, not with tears, but with the light of being seen. "You don't need to save me." "Elias, I know. I just want a place where you don't gotta save yourself alone." That night, after the kids slept, Elias stepped outside to watch the stars. Clara joined him, a blanket around her shoulders. The silence between them a shared breath. The moon bathed the land in silver, a frog croaking in the distance. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It is," he said, "but not as much as what's growing here." She leaned into him not for warmth, but for choice. Inside, the wooden butterfly waited for morning. Spring spread like a promise buds on the cottonwoods, green staining the valley. The Holt homestead breathed easier, days passing in quiet rhythm, eggs gathered, bread baked, kids running barefoot on wet grass. Elias carved with the window open, his hands lighter, his heart less heavy. Clara tended the garden, sleeves rolled, hair loose, planting sage where Sarah's flowers once grew. The kids claimed the creek, Maisie naming her favorite flower Sarah's star. Nothing loud marked their days, but there was a fullness in the stillness, a held breath that didn't need exhaling. Then the riders came. Late afternoon. Dust rose like a warning from the southern trail. Elias saw it from the barn, a line of earth torn under a fading sky. 3 riders, one in a black coat, the others in fine suits, their horses cutting through the land like a scythe. The kids gathered on the porch, Elias stepping in front of them, his stance calm but unyielding. Clara emerged, a damp cloth in hand, freezing as the lead rider dismounted. He was tall, sharp-featured, his coat dusted, but his boots gleaming too clean for an honest man. His smile was a blade, cold and cruel. "Clara," he drawled, feigning warmth. "Ain't this a sight?" She didn't speak, her jaw tight. "Long ride," he went on. "Heard you were here. Took some trackin', but you didn't hide too well. Figured you'd latch onto someone quick." Elias stepped forward, his voice low. "Who are you?" The man turned, his gaze cutting. "Silas Creed. Husband. Father, when it suits me." Clara's hands shook, the cloth tucked into her apron. "You ain't welcome," Elias said, his tone final. Silas laughed, sharp and hollow. "I gotta say, those are my young'uns. You've kept 'em from their rightful kin. You left 'em to die," Clara said, her voice clear as a bell. "Easy, darlin'. You turned your back when we needed food, a fire, a home." "I made mistakes," Silas said, hands raised in mock surrender. "But by law, They're mine. No law calls abandonment a claim, Elias said. Silas's smile twisted. And who are you? Her savior, or the next fool she's roped in? Elias didn't answer. Clara stepped beside him, her voice steady. What do you want custody? My kids, my right. You can tag along, but they leave with me tomorrow. The kids watched, eyes wide. Maisie clutched Sarah to her chest. You can't take 'em, Clara said. Silas's face hardened. I can, and I will. Don't make me fetch the law. He mounted his horse, his confidence a weapon, and rode off, dust swallowing his tracks. That night, the cabin was a tomb of silence. The kids knew to be still. Clara paced, folding cloths that didn't need folding, her hands trembling. Elias sat, sharpening his knife, the rhythm a comfort. He can't take 'em, she whispered. He will. He'll come with papers or worse. He's a man who wields words like a whip. We'll fight him, Elias said. Won't be easy. Law favors the claimant, no matter the wrong. I won't marry again to keep my kids, she said, her voice fierce. I won't trade one cage for another. You won't have to. Her eyes met his. Fear and fire intertwined. Even if you're good. Elias, even if I trust you, it ain't freedom. I ain't offering marriage, he said. I'm offering to stand by you if it comes to that. I thought we were safe, she said, her voice breaking. You were. You are. But shadows don't knock. The next day, Silas returned with 2 men, one with a badge, the other with a briefcase. Sheriff Grayson, known to some as just, to others as bought. They dismounted, the sheriff holding a paper. Ma'am, you've kept your children from their father. Per Mr. Creed's affidavit, they're to be placed in his custody pending review. He abandoned us, Clara said, her voice trembling but firm. I have witnesses. He left us to die. Got proof, the sheriff asked. Elias stepped forward. Half the town saw her survive that storm on grit alone. She's built a life here. Those kids live because of her. The sheriff glanced at the paper. Maybe so, but the judge decides. Till then, they go with their father. Clara's knees wavered. Elias steadied her, his hand a rock. Then a voice rang out Mrs. Tanner, the mercantile owner, arriving on her wagon. That man's no father, she bellowed. He's a liar and a drunk. Ask Doc Ellis. Ask Reverend Boone. Ask anyone who's seen her raise those kids while he rotted in saloons. More voices joined Doc Ellis. Reverend Boone. Young Caleb from the livery. They came with truth, not weapons. The sheriff hesitated, caught between law and justice. Take it to court, Mr. Creed. I won't drag kids off with the town against it. Silas's face twisted, but he rode off, slower this time. The sheriff followed, muttering about judges. The townsfolk lingered, their presence a quiet shield. Clara thanked them, her voice thick. Elias watched, his heart swelling with something he couldn't name. That night, Clara stood by the fire, arms wrapped tight. He'll come back, she said, with more papers, sharper words. Then we'll be sharper, Elias said. She looked at him not with fear, but with hope's fragile shape. I meant to leave come spring. Find somewhere new, without ghosts. You still can. She stepped closer. Maybe ghosts ain't what haunt me. Maybe it's fear, nothing lasts. Elias pulled a wooden ring from his pocket, simple, carved with care. Made this before the snow melted, he said. Ain't a proposal, just proof I believe in something that lasts. She took it, holding it like a promise. Thank you, she whispered. The fire crackled. The kids slept. The wind carried earth and ash. A choice was made not from fear, but from defiance. Love unseen but felt. The final snow fell late that spring, soft and unbidden. A ghost of winter passed. It dusted the greening hills, a fleeting veil. It didn't linger, but it reminded them the past didn't always fade. That morning, Clara stood by the window, watching the snow kiss the garden's new sprouts. She wore Elias's shirt, its sleeves too long, its scent of pine and smoke a comfort. Behind her, the cabin hummed. Jasper and Levi bickering over chores. Maisie singing to Sarah. Elias carved at the table, a bird taking flight under his knife. He caught her reflection, and she felt it. Hooves broke the stillness, not one, but many, a thunder of intent. Elias stood, eyes sharp. Clara reached the door, her heart a drum. Silas dismounted, his coat pristine, flanked by two men, one with a briefcase, the other a judge, his badge gleaming. I'm back, Silas sneered. The lawyer spoke, papers in hand. This ruling grants Mr. Creed immediate custody. They belong here, Elias said, his voice a growl. The judge stepped forward, his face hard. Law decides, not heart. Mr. Creed is their father. Clara's voice rang out. These kids learned safety in this home. This man fed 'em, warmed 'em, showed 'em steady, Silas mocked, hidin' under another's roof. Elias's gaze was ice. I gave him a place to grow. She has no legal standing, the judge said. I'm their mother, Clara said. A woman with no husband. Silas cut in. Maisie stepped onto the porch, clutching Sarah. He's everything, she said, her voice small but fierce. The judge hesitated, but shook his head. Sentiment don't change law. Elias spoke, his voice a blade. We'll go with you, make it public. Let a court with witnesses decide. Silas faltered, his confidence cracking. I'll bring this town to testify against you, Elias said. I'll go to Cheyenne if I must. The judge sighed. He can appeal under the Homestead Act. It'll delay enforcement a week. Then we'll do that, Elias said. The men conferred, displeased, and agreed to reconvene in 3 days. They left. Silas's glare a promise of return. The porch held the weight of what nearly was. Clara turned to Elias. You knew the law, learned it after Sarah. You read a lot when you can't sleep. You stood between us. I'd do it again, he said, if you let me. That night, Clara sat with the kids, whispering they were safe for now. Elias tended the fire, the cabin alive with their shared life. He pulled a cradle from under the table, crafted in secret, unfinished, waiting. He set it by the fire. Clara's breath caught. You made this, she whispered, for what might be. You think we'll need it, I hope, he said. She touched the cradle, her voice breaking. I'm scared. Fears lived in my bones too long. I know, he said. But it ain't all you are. Her eyes met his, bright with trust. You believe that I do? Then I do too. The trial came swift. They entered town as a family bound by choice, not blood. The courtroom overflowed Mrs. Tanner, Doc Ellis, Reverend Boone. Half the town bearing witness. Silas's words were hollow, his charm a mask. Clara spoke once, her voice clear. I'd rather live poor, live quiet, With my kids in a place they can grow than see 'em follow a man who only sees himself in their eyes. Elias took the stand. I was lost till I found him, not 'cause I needed savin', but 'cause I had nothin' left to give. They came hungry, brave, and taught me what livin' means. The judge ruled for Clara, full custody. Silas denied. Outside, Clara hugged her kids, then turned to Elias. The sun broke through, light warm on the steps, a breeze carrying sage and dust. She pulled the wooden ring from her pocket. "I've carried this since you gave it," she said. "Not 'cause I had to, but 'cause it felt like something real." "You don't owe me," he said. "I know," she said, taking his hand. "I want to stay, not just for the kids, but 'cause you're home." He pulled her close, the kids laughing around them. That night, a letter arrived Silas's cousin in Cheyenne, offering Clara a home. But she burned it in the fire, choosing Elias. They sat by the hearth, the cradle rocking, love blooming like sage in spring.